Hello class, it's Mrs. Poffenberger, and today's lesson is going to be our fourth lesson in Chapter 3, and it's going to deal with muscular and nervous tissue, and this will be our last lesson of Chapter 3. So starting first here with muscular tissue. So the main function of muscle in the body is to produce movement, and there are three types of muscular tissue in the body: skeletal muscle, cardiac muscle, and smooth muscle. Skeletal muscle can be controlled voluntarily in the body. So voluntarily, what that means is that you are able to control it yourself. You determine when you move your arm or your leg. You can do that on your own. Skeletal muscle cells attach to connective tissue like tendons, which will then connect them to bone or other structures of the body. The cells of skeletal muscle tissue are striated, which means they have a striped or banding pattern. So over here in the diagram, you can see sort of all these stripes throughout skeletal muscle. So that gives it this banding or striped pattern underneath the microscope. And skeletal muscle cells have more than one nucleus, so more than one nucleus. And we can see that here. So there's a nucleus, and this is one cell. So that's one cell, and right there you can already see it has two nuclei in that particular cell. So here we see skeletal muscle underneath a light microscope. So each one of these is a cell. So there's a cell, there's another one, and so on. You can see the nuclei are stained purple, they're very flattened, and they're toward the cell membrane of the muscle cell. So if we look at one muscle cell here, we can see all those nuclei right at the cell membrane. And then we can see all of the striations, those stripes or banding pattern throughout the muscle. And I'm not doing a very good job tracing them, but you see all of those bands. Those are the striations. And in skeletal muscles, we usually don't call them cells, we actually call them fibers. But if you hear muscle fiber, that means the same as muscle cell. Cardiac muscle is the second type of muscular tissue in the body. It's found only in the heart, and it functions to pump blood. And it's going to be involuntary, so you don't control when your heart actually pumps. It does that on its own, controlled by the heart, the cells of the heart, and by the brain. Cardiac muscle cells attach to other cardiac muscle cells at what are called intercalated discs, and these intercalated discs make this striated banding pattern on cells. So these cells are also striated, but in comparison to skeletal muscle, they only have one nucleus per cell. And here we can see these sort of zigzag structures here. Those are the intercalated discs. The nuclei are still flattened, and we still have sort of that banding pattern that skeletal muscles have, but the intercalated discs really make the bands visible. So here's cardiac muscle underneath a microscope. We can see those intercalated discs. They're very thick bands throughout the skeletal muscle, or the cardiac muscle. And we also see that these cells are very branched. So here's a cell. We can see here that it's branching off, so they kind of split and branch, and there's only one nucleus per cell. So there's the nucleus there, only one per cell in cardiac muscle. Smooth muscle, the last type of muscular tissue in the body, is involuntary also, so you cannot control your smooth muscle cells or your smooth muscle. It surrounds hollow organs in the body, such as your intestines, and they attach to other smooth muscle cells. They do not have any visible striations, so no visible striations, and they have one nucleus per cell. So looking at smooth muscle cells and smooth muscle tissue underneath the microscope, one nucleus per cell, you can see the nuclei pretty easily. Sometimes it's hard to see where the cells start and stop because they are connected to one another, but here is kind of one of those spindle-like elongated smooth muscle cells, and there we can see the nuclei. And no striations in smooth muscle cells, hence why it's called smooth. And then our last type of tissue would be nervous tissue. So nervous tissue is made up of the neurons, which are nerve cells, and all the cells that support those neurons. The main function of nervous tissue is to send impulses to other areas of the body, and it deals with two functions, irritability and conductivity. So taking in the information, processing it, and then sending out a response. So looking at nervous tissue underneath the microscope, we see these very large neurons. So that's the cell body of the neuron. These are the what are called dendrites and axons, the cell processes. So we can see lots of neurons here in our nervous tissue. We also see little tiny dots of nuclei throughout. And I changed my color here, so hopefully we can see sort of the nuclei of those supporting cells throughout the nervous tissue. And then getting into concluding here our lesson on cells and tissues, we're going to talk a little bit about tissue repair. So depending on the type of tissue you have, depends on how well it can be repaired. So some tissues are able to regenerate pretty easily. So regeneration means replacing the destroyed tissue with the same kinds of cells. So basically just replacing the tissue. It's going to look the same pretty much, and it's going to function the same. So a good example of this can be the skin. Skin regenerates very easily. Fibrosis is repair of the tissue by dense fibrous connective tissue, so scar tissue. So any tissue that repairs itself by just replacing the damaged area with scar tissue, that would be fibrosis. And scar tissue will help with structure, but it's not going to have the same function. So for instance, in the heart, if you have a heart attack, an area of the heart muscle has died, that heart muscle will no longer function. If it's replaced with dense connective tissue, it's not going to be able to function like normal heart tissue, cardiac muscle tissue. For the determination of the method, the type of tissue damaged, and the severity of the injury. So if it's a very large injury, then most likely more dense connective tissue. And again, depending if it's epithelial tissue, connective, nervous, or muscle, that will depend on whether or not it can be repaired. So the steps that occur in tissue repair, so first your capillaries, which are your very small blood vessels, they become very permeable. So they become very permeable to nutrients, white blood cells, all sorts of things that are going to help repair that tissue. Also, clotting factors or clotting proteins are going to be introduced to the area to form a clot, and that's going to prevent blood loss and hold the edges of the wound together. It's also going to wall off the area from bacteria, so we don't want bacteria getting in there, causing an infection, and making that a life-threatening event for the individual. The first type of tissue that will be formed is called granulation tissue, and this is a very pink tissue that's made of new capillaries. So you'll see this, if you get a cut on the skin, that area of the skin will sort of be pink once it's healing, once the scab goes away, and that's just that granulation tissue. And then you'll have regeneration of that surface epithelium, and the tissue will be repaired. So tissues that regenerate very easily would be epithelial tissue, fibrous connective tissue, and bone. Tissues that regenerate poorly would be skeletal muscle, and tissues that are replaced largely by scar tissue would be cardiac muscle, and nervous tissue within the brain and spinal cord. Looking at the developmental aspects of tissue, so the epithelial tissues arise from all three primary germ layers. So an embryo has three germ layers: endoderm, ectoderm, and mesoderm. And epithelial tissue comes from all three. Muscle and connective tissue arise from the mesoderm. Nervous tissue comes from the ectoderm. And as we age, in general, there's a decrease in mass and viability in most tissues, which makes sense. If you look at elderly individuals, they have usually lost muscle mass, and have a decreased just overall mass in viable tissue. So again, just looking at those three germ layers, so an embryo does have those three germ layers: ectoderm, mesoderm, and endoderm. And an embryo in its early stage is called a blastula, which is just a tiny ball of cells. So here we have our blastula, and we can see those three parts. So the blue is ectoderm, the yellow is endoderm, and the red is mesoderm. And once the embryo develops, it becomes a gastrula, which is the embryonic stage where the three germ layers are totally formed. So we can see that down here. So the blue, the red, the yellow are those three germ layers: ectoderm, mesoderm, and endoderm. And on this last slide, you can just see what some of those layers produce. So the endoderm produces lung cells in the lungs, thyroid and pancreas. Mesoderm, muscle, so cardiac, skeletal, smooth muscle, red blood cells, kidneys, and the ectoderm, your skin, the brain, and cells in the skin that produce pigment. So those are some examples of what come from those three layers. Okay, thanks so much for listening. I hope you enjoyed the lesson. Hope you learned something. And as always, have a great one. We'll see you later.